Christmas night. While families gathered around glowing trees and exchanged gifts, a 19-year-old woman in Huntington Beach, California, was fighting for her life. Abducted at gunpoint steps from her front door, she endured hours of unimaginable terror before being thrown naked onto a freezing road and left to die. She survived, but her attackers vanished into the night. For 18 years, the case went cold. No suspects, no arrests, no justice. The evidence sat in storage, and the perpetrators walked free, believing they had gotten away with it. Then something unexpected happened. A minor arrest in 2008 triggered a chain of events that would finally expose the truth and lead investigators to someone hiding in plain sight, someone whose face had been on movie screens across America. This is the story of a survivor who refused to be silenced, a case that seemed impossible to solve, and the moment when science and persistence collided to resurrect justice from the grave of forgotten crimes. In December 1990, the victim was a typical 19-year-old living in Huntington Beach, a coastal city in Orange County, California. She worked part-time while preparing for the upcoming college semester. Those who knew her described her as energetic, cheerful, strong-willed, and genuinely kind. She had no enemies, no involvement with criminal elements or gangs, and no personal conflicts that would explain why anyone would target her. Her life was ordinary in the best sense of the word, filled with work-school friends and plans for the future. On the evening of December the 24th, 1990, she attended a holiday party at a friend's apartment. It was a casual gathering, the kind that happens in every city on Christmas Eve as people celebrate before heading home to their families. When the party wound down, she left to walk home. The distance was short, just a few minutes on foot. She was almost at her front door when her life changed forever. A car slowed down beside her on the quiet street. The driver, a man, rolled down his window and asked for directions. It seemed harmless, the kind of interaction that happens countless times every day in cities across America. A lost driver, a helpful pedestrian, a brief exchange, and then everyone continues on their way. But this time was different. As she began to respond, another man appeared behind her and pressed a gun to her head. Before she could scream or run, she was forced into the vehicle. Her attackers used her own clothing to blindfold her, binding her arms and legs to prevent any resistance. They turned the car's stereo up to maximum volume, drowning out her cries for help as they drove away from the neighborhood she knew, away from safety, away from any chance of immediate rescue. What followed were hours of terror that would scar her for the rest of her life. She was struck repeatedly with the butt of a firearm, causing injuries to her head and body. The men threatened to throw her from a cliff, describing in detail how they would kill her. One of the attackers repeatedly told her, "You're going to die tonight," a statement that turned those hours into a psychological torture as brutal as the physical violence. She was sexually assaulted multiple times inside the vehicle, while the men subjected her to degrading verbal abuse and continued threats against her life. After what she estimated to be several hours, though time had become impossible to track in her state of terror and pain, the attackers threw her out of the moving vehicle onto a deserted road. She was left naked, still blindfolded, covered in injuries, and alone in the December cold. The men drove away, apparently confident that exposure, shock, and her injuries would finish what they had started. But they were wrong about one crucial thing. She was stronger than they realized. Despite being on the edge of complete physical and mental collapse, despite injuries that made every movement agony, despite hypothermia setting in from the freezing night air, she managed to crawl across the pavement to a nearby house. Summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, she knocked on the door, pleading for help. The homeowner who answered immediately recognized the emergency and called 911. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. The investigation into what would become known as one of the most brutal cold cases in California history had begun. Law enforcement officers who responded that night collected evidence according to the protocols of the time. Medical personnel at the hospital conducted a rape kit examination, collecting biological evidence, including semen samples from the victim's body. These samples contained the attacker's DNA, a biological fingerprint that would prove crucial nearly 2 decades later. Detectives took detailed statements from the victim documenting every detail she could remember, despite her traumatized state. They photographed her injuries, collected her torn clothing, and began the process of trying to identify her attackers. But the investigation quickly ran into insurmountable obstacles. The victim had been blindfolded for almost the entire ordeal and could not provide descriptions of her attackers' faces. She had not seen the vehicle's license plate number. There were no witnesses to the abduction or to her being thrown from the car. The attack had occurred late at night on a quiet residential street where most people were inside, celebrating the holiday. The vehicle itself was generic enough that the victim's limited description could have matched thousands of cars in Southern California. Detectives followed every lead they had, which in practical terms meant they had almost nothing to follow. They canvassed the neighborhood where the abduction occurred, interviewed people who had attended the party, checked local hospital records for anyone who had been treated for injuries that night, and ran the limited checks available through law enforcement databases in 1990. Nothing produced a viable suspect. The DNA evidence sat in storage because in 1990, DNA databases were in their infancy. California had only begun implementing DNA collection in specific circumstances, primarily for convicted sex offenders. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, which would later become a powerful tool for solving cold cases, was still being developed at the federal level and was not yet widely implemented across state and local jurisdictions. The technology to analyze DNA existed, but the infrastructure to match samples across different cases and jurisdictions was limited. Without a suspect to compare the DNA against the biological evidence, was simply preserved and filed away with the rest of the case materials. As weeks turned into months and then years, with no breaks in the case, it was eventually classified as a cold case. The file was stored in the archives joining hundreds of other unsolved crimes. For the investigators who had worked on it, the case remained a source of frustration and regret. They knew who the victim was. They knew what had happened to her. They had physical evidence, but they had no way to identify the perpetrators. For the victim, December 24, 1990 became a dividing line in her life, separating everything into before and after. The physical injuries healed over time, though some would cause chronic pain for years. But the psychological wounds ran far deeper and would take much longer to even begin to heal. She changed her name, hoping a new identity might help her escape the constant reminders. She tried to move forward with schoolwork friendships and eventually relationships. But post-traumatic stress disorder followed her everywhere. Sleep became a battlefield. She would lie awake for hours, jumping at every sound, unable to let her guard down. When sleep finally came, nightmares would jolt her awake heart pounding momentarily, unsure if she was safe in her bedroom or trapped in that car on Christmas Eve 1990. Ordinary sounds became triggers. A car door closing at night sent her heart racing. The screech of brakes flooded her body with adrenaline and terror. Even hearing the same music that had played in the attacker's car could spiral her into distress. Panic attacks struck without warning, sometimes in public, tightening her chest and narrowing her vision until she felt like she was suffocating, yet she persevered. Through years of therapy with trauma specialists, she learned coping mechanisms and built a support system. She married and worked to create the normal life stolen from her that Christmas Eve. But the shadow of 1990 never left, and knowing her attackers remained free was a wound that refused to heal. Nearly 18 years passed that. The calendar turned from 1990 to 2000, and then toward 2010. For the victim now living under her new name and trying to build a life, those years were a mixture of healing setbacks, progress, and ongoing struggle. For her attackers, those years represented something very different. They represented successfully getting away with a serious, violent crime. One of those attackers was a man named Joseph Youngmin Sun. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Sun lived in California, apparently unburdened by legal consequences for what had happened on Christmas Eve 1990. He was not under investigation. No detectives knocked on his door. The case file sat in storage, and Sun's name appeared nowhere in it. In fact, during some of those years, Sun's career as a mixed martial arts fighter and actor was actually flourishing. He competed in early Ultimate Fighting Championship events and eventually landed a role in the 1997 blockbuster comedy Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery, playing a henchman character named Random Task, a parody of the James Bond villain Oddjob. The character was memorable enough that Sun appeared in promotional materials and became a recognizable face to millions of moviegoers. But in 2008, Sun made a mistake, a seemingly minor infraction that would set in motion the chain of events that would finally bring him to justice. Sun was arrested for vandalism after damaging another person's vehicle. In the hierarchy of criminal offenses, vandalism ranks relatively low. It typically results in fines, probation, perhaps some jail time for repeat offenders, but it is not considered a serious, violent crime. Under normal circumstances, someone arrested for vandalism would be processed, potentially spend a night or two in jail, post bail, and deal with the charges through the court system without much fanfare. But by 2008, the legal landscape in California had changed dramatically from what it had been in 1990. In the intervening years, California had significantly expanded its DNA collection policies. Proposition 69, approved by California voters in 2004, mandated that any adult arrested for a felony offense must provide a DNA sample for inclusion in the state's database. This represented a massive expansion from earlier policies that only required DNA collection from convicted sex offenders and certain other specific categories of criminals. The vandalism charge against Sun qualified under these new regulations. When he was arrested, a DNA sample was collected through a simple cheek swab and sent to the California Department of Justice's DNA laboratory for analysis. The sample was processed and entered into the state's DNA database, where sophisticated software would compare it against DNA profiles from unsolved crimes stretching back decades. Within days, the system flagged a match. Joseph Sun's DNA profile was identical to the date profile derived from the semen samples collected from the victim on December 25, 1990. The match was not partial or probable. It was absolute, a one in several billion certainty. The biological evidence that had sat in storage for 18 years had finally found its match. The notification reached the Huntington Beach Police Department's cold case unit. Detectives pulled the file from 1990, reading through the reports that had been written before some of them had even joined the force. They reviewed the victim's statements, the medical evidence, the photographs of her injuries, and the forensic reports on the DNA samples. Everything was still there, preserved according to protocol, waiting for this moment. Investigators began building a case against Sun. They reviewed his background, his whereabouts in December 1990, his known associates, and any other information they could gather. The timeline fit perfectly. He had been in California in the general area of Huntington Beach with no alibi that would exclude him from the crime. Physical descriptions provided by the victim, though limited due to the blindfold, were consistent with Sun's build and general appearance. Voice characteristics mentioned in the victim's statement aligned with Sun's speech patterns. As detectives dug deeper into Sun's background and associates, they identified his accomplice from the 1990 attack. Santiago Lopez Gaitan was located and arrested in Tucson. With 2 suspects in custody and DNA evidence that could not be disputed, prosecutors moved forward with charges. The legal process, however, was not straightforward. California law included statutes of limitations for many crimes, setting time limits within which charges must be filed. By 2008, the statute of limitations had expired for some of the most serious offenses committed against the victim, including rape and kidnapping. Under normal circumstances, This would have meant that Sun and Gaitan could not be prosecuted for those crimes despite the DNA evidence proving their guilt. But there was one charge that had no statute of limitations in California: torture. The crime of torture defined in California. Penal Code Section 206 as inflicting great bodily injury upon another person with the intent to cause cruel or extreme pain and suffering. For revenge, extortion, persuasion, or any sadistic purpose is considered so heinous that the state allows prosecution regardless of how much time has passed. The evidence from 1990, including the victim's detailed account of being repeatedly struck with a firearm, threatened with death, and subjected to hours of physical and psychological torment, clearly met the legal definition of torture. Prosecutors filed charges of torture against both Sun and Gaitan. The case would finally go to trial nearly 21 years after the crime occurred. The courtroom proceedings attracted significant media attention, particularly after it was revealed that one of the defendants had appeared in a major Hollywood film. The story became a fixture in local and national news. An actor who had played a comedic villain in Austin Powers was being tried for real-life crimes of shocking brutality. For the victim, now in her late 30s and going by her new name, the trial represented both an opportunity for justice and a fresh trauma. She would have to face her attackers in court, recount the details of the worst night of her life in front of strangers, and undergo cross-examination by defense attorneys whose job was to challenge her credibility. When the trial began, she entered the courtroom using her new legal name, the identity she had built over the past 2 decades. Sun and Gaita sat at the defense table, Sun reportedly showing little emotion throughout much of the proceedings. The victim took the witness stand and, speaking clearly, despite visible emotional strain, described what had happened on December 24, 1990. Her testimony was detailed and consistent with the statements she had given to police and medical personnel immediately after the attack. She explained how she had been abducted while walking home, how she had been blindfolded and restrained, how she had endured hours of violence and assault, and how she had been abandoned on a dark road in the middle of winter. When asked about specific memories that still haunted her, she recalled the attackers laughing at her tears, and one of them telling her that Christmas was the perfect night to kill someone because everyone would be too busy celebrating to notice. She also spoke about the aftermath, about the 18 years she had spent knowing her attackers were never caught, about the PTSD that had dominated much of her adult life, and about what it meant to finally face them in a courtroom. "I thought I was going to die," she testified. "I remember begging them to let me live." She wanted the jury to understand that she had not merely survived, she had overcome. "I want the court to know that I didn't just survive," she stated. "I overcame this to stand here today." The prosecution built its case around several key elements. The DNA evidence was presented by forensic experts who explained in detail how DNA profiling works, how samples are preserved, how matches are determined, and why the match between Sun's Dikisidane and the Digidai from the 1990 crime scene was scientifically irrefutable. The probability that the D belonged to someone other than Sun was calculated at astronomical odds that effectively ruled out any possibility of coincidence. The victim's testimony was supported by the medical records from 1990, which documented injuries consistent with her account of being struck repeatedly and physically assaulted. The records included photographs taken at the hospital showing bruises, contusions, and other trauma that corroborated her description of the attack. The prosecution also presented testimony about the victim's life after the attack, including statements from therapists who had treated her for PTSD and trauma-related conditions. This evidence was intended to demonstrate the long-term impact of the crime and to support the torture charge by showing that the effects of the December 1990 attack had been profound and lasting. The defense faced an uphill battle. The DNA evidence was conclusive and could not be explained away. Defense attorneys focused on procedural issues, questioned the reliability of memories from nearly 20 years earlier, and argued about the legal definitions and applications of the charges. For Gaitan, the defense strategy eventually shifted toward negotiating a plea agreement. Santiago Lopez Gaitan accepted a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to his role in the attack, he was sentenced to 17 years and 4 months in state prison. The plea agreement spared him a longer potential sentence, but ensured he would spend significant time behind bars. Joseph Son's case proceeded to verdict. After hearing all the evidence, reviewing the forensic reports, and considering the victim's testimony, the jury found Son guilty of torture. In 2011, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The judge's sentencing remarks emphasized the brutality of the crime, the lasting harm inflicted on the victim, and the fact that Son had lived free for 18 years while his victim struggled with the consequences of his actions. The conviction and sentencing generated extensive public discussion. Many people expressed shock at learning that someone who had appeared in a mainstream Hollywood comedy had been convicted of such serious crimes. The contrast between Son's on-screen persona as a comedic henchman and his real-life criminal actions was jarring and became a focal point of media coverage. For the victim, the conviction represented a form of closure that she had not been sure would ever come. In interviews given after the trial, she spoke about what the verdict meant to her. "I waited 18 years to breathe completely," she said, describing how the uncertainty and fear of knowing her attackers were never caught had been a constant weight. With their convictions, she could finally release some of that burden. She decided to share her story publicly under the title, "My Name is Victoria." Using the name Victoria publicly for the first time, she spoke openly about the attack, the long years of silence and fear, and the journey toward healing. For her, telling the story was part of the healing process, a way to reclaim her narrative and to transform from a nameless victim in a cold case file into a survivor with a voice and a message. The scars from December 24, 1990 never fully faded. She continued to battle chronic back pain, dizziness, and soft tissue injuries. PTSD remained a constant companion, triggered by sounds as simple as a car door closing or brakes screeching. Yet she also discovered profound resilience within herself. She married, maintained friendships, and built a meaningful life. The attack had tried to destroy her, but it failed. This case transformed criminal justice in multiple ways. It demonstrated the revolutionary power of DNA databases to resurrect cold cases that seemed permanently unsolvable. The evidence collected in 1990, nearly useless at the time, became the key to justice 18 years later when technology and expanded databases finally caught up. Son's arrest for vandalism, a minor offense, triggered the DNA match that connected him to the 1990 attack, proving how changes in California's DNA collection laws could catch criminals years after their crimes. The case exposed critical flaws in statutes of limitations. Despite DNA proof of rape, prosecutors could not charge Son with that crime because too much time had passed. This injustice sparked reforms across California and other states, with many arguing that serious violent crimes should have no time limits when DNA evidence exists. The case also validated the importance of meticulous evidence preservation. The DNA samples remained viable for testing only because medical personnel, forensic technicians, and evidence custodians followed proper protocols for 18 years, ensuring that when technology advanced, the evidence was still there. Victoria's public testimony illuminated the lifelong impact of violent crime and the courage required to confront trauma. Her decision to speak openly helped other survivors feel less alone and challenged society to better support victims. The case also shattered stereotypes about criminals. Son was not a shadowy predator, but someone with a public career who appeared on movie screens. The revelation that the comedic henchman from Austin Powers was convicted of torture based on irrefutable DNA evidence reminded society that dangerous individuals can hide behind respectable facades. For law enforcement, the case proved that cold cases are not hopeless. With advancing forensic technology and dedicated investigators, justice can prevail even decades later. Every piece of carefully preserved evidence represents hope that truth will eventually emerge. This story teaches us that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly impossible. It requires the evolution of forensic science, the dedication of law enforcement, proper evidence, preservation, and the extraordinary courage of survivors who refuse to let their attackers escape accountability. We invite you to share your thoughts on this case in the comments below. Please base your perspectives on the facts presented and the official court records. If you found this case compelling and want to follow more in-depth coverage of mysterious and disturbing cases that challenge our understanding of justice, perseverance, and human resilience, please subscribe to our channel. Each case we cover represents real people, real struggles, and real triumphs, and by engaging with these stories, we honor survivors and support the ongoing pursuit of justice.